Carl Jung's final message about empaths will shatter everything you believe about your compassion. The empath, Jung discovered, is just the child who was never allowed to be selfish. That overwhelming need to fix everyone, to absorb their pain, to disappear yourself for others. That's not spiritual gift. That's survival programming from a childhood where your needs were too much, your feelings too loud, your very existence conditional on serving others. But here's what makes Jung's insight revolutionary. He didn't view empaths as broken individuals, but as people halfway through what he called individuation, the psychological journey toward wholeness. You already know this deep down. You've always sensed that your empathy came with an impossible-to-name price. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But you've always felt that who you truly are was never allowed to exist, that your authentic self was sacrificed to keep others comfortable. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why your sensitivity feels like both a gift and a burden. You'll recognize the psychological patterns that turned your natural empathy into a survival strategy. And you'll discover Jung's path to what I call sacred selfishness, the healthy boundaries that transform empathy from compulsion into conscious choice. Jung understood something most people miss about empathic development. What we call empathy in adults often begins as emotional hypervigilance in childhood, a survival mechanism that develops when a child's safety depends on constantly monitoring the emotional states of their caregivers. The child who learns to read their parents' moods before they even speak. The little one who becomes the family emotional barometer, always sensing storms before they hit. The kid who learns that their own needs create tension, but anticipating others' needs creates safety. Jung called this premature ego adaptation. Your nervous system became a seismograph for danger, attuned to every emotional tremor in your environment. You developed what Jung termed psychological antennae, an extraordinary ability to sense what others feel and need. But Jung discovered that this survival adaptation came with a terrible cost, the suppression of your authentic selfishness, the healthy narcissism that every child needs to develop a strong sense of self. You learned the opposite lesson: love others more than yourself because your needs are dangerous. This creates the empathic paradox. The very sensitivity that makes you so attuned to others becomes the barrier that prevents you from knowing yourself. You became an expert in everyone else's inner world while remaining a stranger to your own. Jung made a startling discovery about what lies hidden in the unconscious of people with empathic patterns. In the shadow, the rejected parts of the psyche, he found what I call forbidden selfishness, the natural self-advocacy that was deemed unacceptable in childhood. Most empaths carry tremendous guilt about their shadow because it contains everything they were taught was wrong: anger, boundaries, saying no, putting themselves first, having needs, demanding respect. But here's Jung's revolutionary insight: these selfish impulses aren't pathological, they're the missing pieces of a complete personality. The empath who never learned healthy selfishness becomes what Jung termed a wounded healer, someone who gives from emptiness rather than fullness. Jung observed that empaths often unconsciously resent their own compassion. They give and give, but underneath there's rage, exhaustion, a part that wants to stop caring, to walk away, to choose themselves for once. This isn't because they're bad people, but because Jung's compensation principle is at work. Integration of the shadow isn't about becoming selfish, but about reclaiming the right to exist as a complete human being. The empath's shadow contains their sacred selfishness, the healthy ego strength that allows for authentic relationships. Jung identified a specific crisis that empaths face: the individuation imperative, the moment when the psyche demands that you become who you actually are, not who you learn to be for survival. This crisis often manifests as empathic burnout, not just tiredness, but a deep soul exhaustion that comes from living inauthentically for years. The symptoms are unmistakable: you can't fake caring anymore, people's problems feel heavy instead of meaningful, you start resenting the very thing that wants to find you. Jung saw this not as failure, but as psychological emergence. Your authentic self is trying to be born, but it requires dismantling the false self that was built around serving others. Here the Jungian concept of the transcendent function becomes crucial, the psyche's ability to bridge opposites. It's not about choosing between empathy and selfishness, but about integrating both into what Jung called individuated wholeness. Empaths in this crisis often feel like they're betraying everyone by changing. People say, "You're not the same person anymore," or "You've become selfish." Jung understood this as the collective's resistance to individual development. But Jung discovered that people who truly love you will support your individuation. The ones who resist it were benefiting from your self-abandonment. Jung introduced a concept often misunderstood: sacred selfishness. This isn't narcissistic self-absorption, but what Jung called the ethical obligation to become yourself, the recognition that your first responsibility is to your own psychological development. Conscious selfishness involves several key elements. First, emotional sovereignty, recognizing that you're not responsible for managing other people's feelings. Second, boundary consciousness, the ability to sense where you end and others begin. Third, need legitimacy, accepting that your needs are as valid as anyone else's. Jung discovered that empaths who develop sacred selfishness actually become more helpful, not less. They give from choice rather than compulsion, from fullness rather than emptiness, from strength rather than weakness. This creates what Jung called differentiated love, the capacity to care for others without losing yourself in the process. Jung made a profound observation about what happens to empaths' relationships when they begin practicing sacred selfishness. He called it relational recalibration, the process where relationships either deepen through mutual authenticity or end because they were based on the empath's self-abandonment. When empaths stop playing these functional roles, some people experience what I call supply withdrawal. They become angry, manipulative, or accusatory because their emotional needs are no longer being automatically met. But Jung also documented something beautiful. The relationships that survive this transformation become authentic encounters. Instead of one person giving and one receiving, both individuals meet as equals, each responsible for their own emotional well-being. Jung understood that empaths must learn relational selectivity. Not everyone deserves access to your empathy. Not every person who asks for help is ready to receive it. Not every relationship that feels familiar is healthy. The individuated empath attracts different people than the self-abandoning empath. They draw those who are also doing their own psychological work rather than those looking for someone to do it for them. Jung's vision of psychological wholeness includes the integrated empath, someone who has reclaimed their sensitivity as a conscious choice rather than an unconscious compulsion. The integrated empath possesses conscious empathy, the ability to feel with others without losing themselves in the process. They've learned to use their sensitivity as a tool rather than being used by it. Jung identified several characteristics of integration. First, emotional choice, the capacity to decide when and how much to feel with others. Second, compassionate detachment, the ability to care without carrying. Third, reciprocal relationships, connections where empathy flows both ways. This integration creates what Jung called earned security, a deep inner stability that doesn't depend on others' approval or emotional state. The integrated empath can witness others' pain without absorbing it, offer support without taking responsibility, and love without losing themselves. Jung's most profound discovery about empath centers on the freedom realization, the moment when you understand that your empathy was never about other people, but about you trying to feel safe in an unpredictable world. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Your hyper-responsibility for others was actually an attempt to control your environment, to prevent the emotional chaos you experienced in childhood." This realization creates what I call authentic empathy, sensitivity that comes from love rather than fear, from choice rather than compulsion, from strength rather than vulnerability. Jung observed that this transformation often triggers existential guilt, the voice in your head that says, "But I've always been the helper," or "People depend on me," or "What if no one loves me if I'm not useful?" But Jung understood this guilt as the final resistance of the false self. He called it identity grief, mourning the version of yourself that was never real but felt familiar. Jung also identified the freedom paradox, the discovery that having the choice to help makes helping more meaningful, not less. When empathy becomes voluntary rather than compulsive, it transforms from burden to gift. The truth Jung revealed is this: you were never meant to be an emotional caretaker for the world. You were meant to be a conscious individual who chooses when and how to offer your gifts. Jung observed that empaths who achieve this sovereignty often go through the reparenting phase, learning to give themselves the unconditional acceptance they never received as children. This internal reparenting is crucial because Jung understood that you cannot give from emptiness indefinitely. The empath who learns to nurture themselves becomes capable of authentic nurturing of others. Psychological sovereignty often involves grieving the unlived life, mourning all the dreams, goals, and experiences you sacrificed to keep others comfortable. But Jung saw this grief as necessary in healing. The empath who achieves this sovereignty discovers something remarkable: their capacity for genuine compassion actually increases. When you're no longer bleeding yourself dry for others, you have more to give from a place of abundance. Free empaths become conscious healers, people who help others from wholeness rather than woundedness. They no longer need to fix people to feel valuable. This creates what Jung called liberated love, affection without strings attached, help that doesn't create dependency, presence that doesn't require reciprocity. Jung's final message about empaths is clear: your journey is not about becoming less sensitive, but about becoming consciously sensitive. It's about reclaiming your empathy as a gift you choose to give rather than a debt you're compelled to pay. Jung understood that the integrated empath becomes a beacon for others not through self-sacrifice but through self-realization. You show the world what it looks like to be both sensitive and strong, caring and boundaried, empathic and whole. The freedom to choose when and how to care is the ultimate gift Jung offered to empaths. It transforms sensitivity from a weakness that others exploit into a strength that you consciously deploy. The empath is just the child who was never allowed to be selfish. But now you understand what Jung really meant. Your empathy isn't your flaw, it's your unfinished development. You learn to use your sensitivity as a survival tool instead of developing it as conscious choice. You don't have to choose between caring for others and caring for yourself. Jung's individuation process shows you how to integrate both into psychological wholeness. The child who was never allowed to be selfish can grow into the adult who chooses when and how to give their gifts. Your sensitivity is indeed a superpower, but only when it comes from strength rather than survival, choice rather than compulsion, wholeness rather than woundedness. The next time someone tells you that you're too sensitive or that you've become selfish, remember Jung's wisdom: you're not too much for this world. You're just finally becoming enough for yourself. And that transformation from unconscious empathy to conscious empathy is exactly what the world needs. Not more people who give until they break, but more people who know their worth and give from overflow. The empath who was never allowed to be selfish is finally free to choose. And that choice to love yourself as much as you love others is the most generous gift you can give to a world that desperately needs whole, conscious, integrated people. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.